Hi, this is Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. Welcome. We just had a wonderful conference last weekend, courtesy of Skildings and Schildings. I don't know how to say it. And I got to speak. My wife, once again, shared a few comments. Very kind to the organizers to allow her to do that again. And got to meet some people in person that I had not gotten to meet. Online friends becoming real life friends, which is so great, like Aaron McIntyre and more. So that was really successful. Certainly, I see a trend towards, um, as my wife spoke to, it went from we have we're a little nervous trying to meet each other and everything the first time to the second time. It's just feels like a reunion of old friends, and we're more focused on what do we do now, activity, organization, making networking, making connections. I realized I should share our conversation about that in the live chat. So let me do that. Where is the chat? There we go. Okay, here's a link to my wife and I reflecting on that conference. If you find that topic of interest, I recommend it to you. We actually went through the talks and talked about some of the things that struck us about them. If my tie, by the way, looks a little strange, it's because it's got green in it, and it's green screening part of the tie. So anyway, hopefully that's amusing to watch. Okay, now support for the show has been gratefully received. Thank you to new contributors at Subscribestar, which is in the video description on YouTube. It's a little unclear to me how much I can trust Twitter numbers, but I think some people are actually watching this on Twitter. So welcome to folks watching on Twitter. I wish I could trust the numbers there, but I don't know what it means really or how comparable those numbers are to YouTube numbers. But it has lots. It shows lots of people seem to at least be looking at it briefly. I don't know. I don't have minutes watched and all that stuff you get from YouTube. Anyway, bringing on Black Horse. Welcome, sir.
Good to see you. I'm glad you guys had a good time at the event. I watched the review. It was sounds like it was an excellent use of time. So
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things that cannot be underestimated is that the effect on morale, I would say.
y-
We have a lot of discouraged people um, right now. And I think to take those people who are discouraged, I shared something from one of them, to take those people who are discouraged and just feeling like they don't know what to do or they just want to leave and turn them into people who want to coordinate, organize. I mean, that's not a terrible outcome, right?
yeah, well, it, I mean, if you imagine yourself as like a 20-something young man coming up in this particular environment, you know, I can understand why it would be. We need to. We'll get into this as the stream goes on, but
Yeah.
uh, but exclusion from positions of traditional power is a really big problem, and I mean
Mm-hmm.
it's a problem for our regime for a variety of reasons. But it also sucks for the people who get excluded. So
Right. I did want to, before we get into today's discussion, I did want to link back to, I believe, the last stream you and I did together. Yes, 2 weeks ago. Last stream you and I did together, um, which was called What Radicalized You? And it was literally Black Horse telling his origin story about going from, uh, I don't know, being groomed for the elite, I guess. It wouldn't be fair to call you the elite because you were like 12, I guess. But
yep,
yeah, but anyway, heading towards being part of the elite to uh, becoming disaffected from that and moving into a counter elite position. Um, and the things you talked about a lot of interesting things, but some of them pretty directly relate to what we're talking about today. That is, I guess we could say, your changing perception of what the elite were all about. Um, so anyway, so you might even be repeating some of the things from that. But if you find that interesting, let me just put the title in here so you know what I'm sharing. What radicalized you? Yeah, sharing that link right now in the live chat. Really recommend that if you didn't didn't see it. Everyone who watched it was really thrilled. Got a ton of feedback on that. In fact, they some people suggested that should just be the first of a series. Talking to people and just having them tell their story of
Yeah,
their origin story. You know.
yeah. I mean, that's a lot of what got the Jay Burden show started, was doing that with people. Um,
Mm.
I, my particular story is that's a Radlib channel exclusive, but
Well, thank you.
well, I artfully dodged the question when he asked it to be on his stream. So there you go.
um, yeah. Oh, he was at the event, so I got to
Yeah,
meet him as well. Yeah.
fantastic guy. So
Okay. So let's see. I don't know. Do you want to bring that article in, or do you want to frame it first?
yeah, I
Frame the
mean,
overall topic.
let's talk about let's talk about the topic, and then
Okay.
we can talk about. So after our discussion, um, after our discussion 2 weeks ago, was that 2 weeks ago?
2 weeks ago.
Two
Two
weeks
weeks
ago.
ago. Yeah.
Yeah, we thought that it might be appropriate to discuss the state of the elites in kind of the American empire. More broadly, it's kind of alluded to in a lot of the other content we do. Um, so, there, if we look at classic elite theory, there's really two elements that an elite need in order to maintain their grip on power. The first is that they have to have a degree of unity, and the second is that they have to have a degree of competence. And the extent to which they're united is the extent to which they protect themselves from from a fracture and part of the elite going after the other part of the elite, and the extent to which they're competent is the extent to which they protect themselves from either a counter elite or some other group, outside of their territory, coming and eating their lunch. And so
Right.
when we discuss the status of Western elites in the last sort of 30 or 40 years, these are really the two factors to look at. And one of the things that I think is quite unique about our position is that in most periods in history that you analyze via elite theory, there are a lot of quite significant threats to an elite from outside their jurisdiction. So if you are looking at, like, I don't know, Louis XIV in France in like the late Middle Ages, uh, there's going to be threats to him from within France, from other members of the elite or from an elite fracture, but it's just as likely for a medieval European dynasty to fall because somebody comes and conquers it as it is that it might fall from an elite fracture or a circulation of elites or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the American Empire, for a variety of historical reasons, doesn't have very many outside enemies. Despite what you might think if you watched
The
if you watched
neocons.
yeah if you watched TV, you'd think that Iran was going to conquer the United States or something. I assure you
Right.
that Iran is not going to conquer the United States.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Really, really, or any great power that you can name. I don't know if Iran even counts as a great power, but I really agree with Caitlin Johnston that Russia is the what is it when they wave the red red cape in front of the ball, right? Russia is what they wave in front of the left wingers, and China is what they wave in front of the right wingers. But this is just, in
uh,
my view,
I mean
a bit silly.
the idea that either of those two groups is a threat to the American elites running the United States is kind of preposterous.
Yeah.
Uh, they might be a threat to the American elites running, like, I don't know, maybe the sovereignty of American elites in like Syria or something,
Yeah. Right.
but certainly not in territories that are sort of properly integrated into the American empire. Like,
Right.
there's no threat that Russia is going to become master over the United Kingdom or something.
Right. 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 Yeah. 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 You're saying that even going beyond the usual America first focus,
Yeah.
even a bit beyond America itself. This is just
Well,
China's going to invade Wales or something. I mean, what?
if you look at the maps of the quote international community that are often put out, right? These are the maps of the G7 countries or whatever. They cover, North America, Australia, and like parts of Europe, and that's about it. And that's the international community. Um, None of those countries are at any substantial risk of losing, of the American elite losing control to some outside force, which
Yeah.
really recasts your thinking in elite theory about the requirement for competence. And I think it explains some of the fundamental transitions you've seen really since 1960 in the way that the American elite is constructed.
Real quick note. I see some confusion in the chat. This is a little bit of a term of art, the term elite. Some people hear it and think it's a term of praise. You know, they are awesome. They're elite. They're the best, the smartest, the brightest, or whatever. That's not the way we're using the term here. It is a neutral descriptive term. It simply refers to the people who are running things. Um, they could be awful people. You know, the elite of the Soviet Union were people like Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky, right? To
Yeah,
call them the elite is not to praise them. It is merely to acknowledge the fact that they were running things, right?
yeah,
So
exactly.
when this whole discussion we're having today, when we say the elites, we use it in a neutral way. We're not. I'm certainly not praising them.
Nor is it a term of like populist derision, which is the other way people read it. We're
Mm.
we're not attempting to imply that these people have no right to rule just because they're the few and there are the many on the outside who might
Oh
prefer,
yeah, right.
right? This is we're talking about this in the value neutral Pareto sense that
Yeah,
every society is run by a small fraction of its population,
yeah.
and every empire is typically run by a small fraction of its population that are typically not located in many parts of the empire, don't have roots
Hmm.
in many parts of the empire. So
Right.
if you're a Brit, for example, it might not be particularly enjoyable that your financial system is run out of New York City, but there's a value neutral description that the overwhelming majority of financial elites in the Western world, you know, live in within 100 miles of Wall Street.
Right. Yeah. As Charlemagne says, it do be that way. It just is.
Yeah. So that's the discussion. Really, there's a, one of the there's two news items that drew this
Yeah.
discussion in the last 2 weeks. The first is this article that came out in, I think it's the Palladium News,
That's right.
which talked about the decline in the ability of Western societies to maintain complex systems. And the second article is, and the second item is the overturning of affirmative action by the Supreme Court today.
Right.
And these are two items that I think are kind of intimately connected with the status of the both the competence and the unity of the elite. And so I think
Right.
it's worth spending some time digging into how they bear on the matter.
I just as an overarching comment before we completely dive in, Black Horse. I've often said, and I'm happy for you to disagree with me on this because you have a different perspective, a different set of experience. I often comment that it sure seems to me like the elite were more effective when I was younger. And in my case, I'm old enough that I'm going way back several decades ago, is what I have in mind. And what I mean by that is I remember them as being uh, more clever, more subtle. So you didn't see what they were doing coming. You know, they didn't like advertise what they were doing. They just sort of quietly moved things in the direction they wanted things to go. And you kind of didn't realize it was happening. Um, Now they seem clumsy, not subtle at all, and not particularly clever. That's sort of my very high level perception shift as I think back to 35 years ago or something to now.
Yeah, and I think what you're observing there is the decline in competence of our elite. And one of the
Hmm.
things that was enormously frustrating to me when I started to realize the decline in competence of an elite is historically associated with the fall of an elite because there are lots of outside threats in most historical situations. But in our historical situation, because there are so few outside threats, the decline in competence of an elite, of our elite, has not coincided with the collapse of that elite, which is like enormously frustrating to watch because you think, well, these guys are morons. Surely somebody is going to come and take their place.
Right, right.
But because of the kind of unique historical situation where they have so few opponents,
Mm-hmm.
it's just not. It hasn't happened that way,
And we've covered it before on this show in some of these things in some detail, but they're holding a lot of cards. We talked about the so-called petrodollar, the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency. That whole system we've gone into great depth on the show. Um, the economic dominance. We've talked about the comparison between people who you would think of as being very similar in terms of what their economic lifestyle is like, namely Western Europe, right? The other part of the free world during the Cold War,
yeah,
and we went into some detail on that, comparing um, the trying to do an apples to apples comparison between someone in Alabama and someone in England or France or something, and we found that surprisingly. Those countries' standard of living is quite below that of almost all the states of the United States.
yeah,
So the United States is rich; it controls the global currency. It's able to profit from that control of the global currency for sure.
yeah. It
It
has
has
effectively the only military in the Western world.
right. I have a video called "124 Years of the GAE," where I talked about the growing global dominance, imperial dominance of the United States. So, on the one hand, we see this declining competence. On the other hand, they're sitting on a throne that
Yes,
they might have inherited it, but they're
but it's
sitting on it.
very
Right?
tall.
It's very tall. Yeah, it's going to take a lot to topple this regime
Yeah.
or these
Well,
elites.
and what's interesting is it creates a situation which is quite unusual in history in that, in some ways, the threat of in the development of an alternative internal or regional elite is a more plausible threat than the development than an than a genuinely external threat, right? So you see this in late Rome where it's more common to lose territory to rebellions than it is to somebody coming and attacking the empire.
Hmm.
Um,
Internal versus external. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and so like it's more likely that whatever aristocrat in Britain just kind of decides that he's not a decides that he wants to have his fiefdom than it is. I mean, how many generals marched on Rome in the last 100 years of the empire? A lot. Um,
Hmm. Yeah,
so you
yeah.
have a
And
very
this helps us understand why it seems puzzling in a way why there's such a freak out over Trump, because as we all know, he's much better at talking than actually like organizing anything, right?
yes,
Um, so why did they freak out so much? And in my view, I'm still trying to solve this puzzle. I'm not sure I have completely nailed it. In my view, uh, he was he did seem to plausibly be um, getting the people behind him. So if he were to somehow accidentally stumble upon a set of elites, counter elites, who could be organized about it, he could have been quite dangerous, right? Um, but which he didn't. He just ended up using the typical elites. Um,
well, I also think that there's this reality that our present elite are so used to having zero challengers that
yeah, that's true.
that even like the most minor threat
They
they're
freak.
they're very sensitive to, right?
Yeah, but
They
what I was going to say is, fitting in with what you were saying, is that Trump would be a threat that's internal rather than external,
That's correct, yeah.
right? If he were to, as I said, stumble on some organized people, like what if his administration had really picked the right people, he had really started clearing them out,
Yeah.
and so forth, with the backing of, you know, massive backing from the populace, right? Um, he could really have done something because it's internal. Whereas, as you've said, we have no plausible external threats to the globalist American empire right now.
Yeah, I mean, like, what if his Secretary of Education, who claimed she wanted to disband the Department of Education, actually did it?
Right,
Like,
right, et cetera, et cetera, all through, all across the regime, right?
yeah,
Really shook things up. Yeah, that could have been quite scary for them, and really potentially put him on a path to being dislodged. As it was, he dislodged nothing, as far as I can tell. But anyway, um, okay.
so
So where do we go from here?
well, let's start a bit. Let's start with this article. So,
Yeah,
do you want to throw it up for a minute?
sure. Give me just a sec. But yeah, just start talking while I get it added here.
So this article appeared in the Palladium Times,
Palladium magazine, it's
Palladium
called.
magazine, sorry, and
Yeah.
the article, you can read it, you can watch it on Skeptical Waves channel, um, makes really articulates two items very powerfully. The first item is that um, is the rise and fall of competence as a criteria for entry into the elite. And it goes all the way from the period, like the late progressive era in the early 20th century, where standardized testing became the norm as a mechanism of entry into the American elite, which is quite a departure from the way that the United States had been managed previously. And not only was standardized testing affected as a mechanism for entry, but it was applied virtually universally, so that almost any American um, had an opportunity to enter the elite class of the United States via excelling in standardized testing as a young child, and then getting placed at an Ivy League institution, and then entering a position of power through that mechanism. And so he kind of cites a series of examples of how the meritocratic selection of elites created an incredibly competent, or a
Yeah.
comparatively quite competent elite in the United States
Right.
for the period between sort of
20s and 60s, he said.
yeah, 20s and 60s.
Yeah.
Maybe you can extend it a bit on both ends depending on, how you want to make the argument. And then he
And by the way,
chronicles the
just distracting thought, which we're not going to pursue right now, and maybe I'll never get to, but it made me wonder a little bit. He talked about a shift into that in the 1920s, and then spends most of the article talking about the collapse of that meritocratic system after the mid 60s. Um, but that early part of the story, what was it like before the 20s? What was this shift? How, what was
well,
the
I
elite
think
less
we
competent before the 1920s? Did it become more competent because of all this use of testing? Anyway, it raised a lot of questions in my mind, and he just, that's not what he was focused on, the end of it, not the beginning of it.
Well, I
But
think you can actually see this in one of the other parts of the story we're going to tell, which is he talks about this in a domestic context. So,
mhm,
standardized testing opened up entry to the elite to basically anyone who was an American, but
mhm,
uh, the competency-based visa system that it has existed in the American Empire for basically since the 50s opened up, and even the way that it was applied in the 40s and the post-war era opened up entry to the elite to basically all citizens of the global American empire, which
mm,
had this a dramatic effect on all the states that were controlled by the American empire. So, I see this as a historian of Canada very dramatically, where basically from 1945 to 19 well basically to 2000, all the best Canadians go to America in order to participate in the American elite.
mm.
Very few highly competent Canadians stay here and attempt to form and develop interests that are regionally distinct from the American elite. The overwhelming majority of high competence Canadians leave Canada and go and make their fortune in the United States, or
And
at least
I'm embarrassed to say I feel very parochial. the only thing that leaps to mind there is comedians,
Yeah, I mean,
Canadian comedians. But I'm sure you probably know about people in other sectors
well,
who were
a good
who were
example
top
of
Canadian talent who moved. You know.
a good example of this is Canada had quite a war industry in the 40s. Yes, Daddy's on the phone. Sorry. Um, Canada had quite a war industry in the 30s and 40s. In the late 50s and early 60s, that industry was decommissioned, and very famously, the aerospace program was almost one for one exchanged into the space program, and many of the engineers that were formerly were engineers of Canadian fighters became engineers that worked on the space shuttle program. And so you can see that there's an effect both on Canada, just like there was an effect on the regional. I call this kind of the strip mining of elites. So if you ask yourself, why does Red America have no leadership class that's partisan on its behalf? Well, the selection effect that went on between the 20s and the 60s is, in my mind, almost certainly part of that story. Because the overwhelming majority of the people that would have become the Red American elite, the Canadian elite, the British elite, whatever, did well on standardized tests, went to an Ivy League school, got recruited by Goldman Sachs or somebody, and became part of the one of the couple of dominant elites in the global American empire, and
Right.
had all of their loyalties to the people who to their ancestors all severed, and instead became loyal to the regime that gave them power.
Right.
But anyways, that's
And
not the
and
part of the
and
story that
and I think, as you pointed out to me, this is not exactly a novel pattern. This is an old imperial pattern.
yeah, I mean, you could
Yeah.
see this in the Bible, right? So
Yeah.
when Babylon conquers Israel, they take all the best people in Israel and make them part of the Babylonian administration.
Exactly. Right. Right.
And over and over in history. And the reasons for it are very clear. First of all, it gives you competent members of your own elite. Second, it creates a class of people who owe their loyalty to you as the kind of the top echelon of that elite class.
And
Instead of
third, it strip mines potential opposition of leadership by
uh,
moving them into your leadership group. Right.
absolutely, so it
Yeah.
both undermines the ability of the provinces to resist you, and it undermines the likelihood of an elite fracture because the people that you're harvesting into your elite only have the constituencies you give them. They don't have the constituencies that they've developed over generations. So I see in the chat a comment. So is brain drain a good thing or a bad thing? Well,
It is a thing. It's just is. It's just a thing that happens in empires, right?
that's right. And not only is it a thing that happens in empires, but it's a phenomena that increases the strength of the elite that dominate that empire.
Right.
The extent to which it's a good thing depends on the extent to which that empire is a good thing.
Yeah. It reinforces the status quo is maybe a way to say it.
Yes.
Right.
And
And
so
and what and that so like you just suggested, that just moves the question to the next thing, which is, well, what do you think of the status quo? And of course, the answer is, well, that depends.
yeah,
Right.
yeah, and I would hazard the argument that the status quo has been of varying qualities during the lifetime of the American Empire, right?
Yeah.
Much more admirable empire in 1950 than it is in 2023.
Right.
So, anyways, that's the first element of the story, and then the second element of the story is the collapse of the standardized testing regime. So,
Yeah.
from the advent of Title IX of the Civil Rights Act in the mid '60s to today, you've seen virtually every one of these competence bars systemically torn down. So first, it became illegal to hire on the basis of standardized testing. So the
We talked
effective
about that.
bar moves from the companies doing entryism to the accreditation system doing entryism. So the universities still recruit on the basis of standardized testing. So if you hire an Ivy League grad, you're relying on the IQ test on the way in order to kind of validate that this is a useful person.
It becomes an extremely expensive 4-year long IQ test from the
Exactly.
point of view of the hiring business, right?
Yes, and it confers this immense power on the Ivy League institutions
Yeah,
because nobody gets hired in a position of power except after passing through that gate of entry.
right.
So there's, and then systematically, maybe culminating in the end in affirmative action and the end of the SAT as the primary criteria for admission, which is really like the last couple of years that the SAT has become like a subordinate. I mean, University of California doesn't even admit on the basis of SAT scores anymore.
Wow.
So, like, it's certainly less important today than it was even 10 years ago, and the efforts to marginalize it are extremely aggressive and have had a lot of success in the last 10 or 15 years.
And the way I would describe this is, I don't know what to call it. It's sort of it's a hide and seek game, right? The people who want to select for competence have to hide how they're doing it, move it around, right? We'll move it over to the colleges. Now we'll do this. Now we'll do that. And the civil rights regime, or whatever you want to call it, the social justice is the term I was talking about in my speech this weekend. The social justice regime wants to seek out meritocratic selection and destroy it.
Destroy it, yes.
Right. So it's not like, oh well, we'll just, you know, that's where a number of us have been talking about. It'd be easy to over celebrate the Supreme Court decision because the idea is, oh, we stopped them and now they're defeated, right? They won't. They'll have to do meritocracy now. No, they'll just find another way. With the collaboration of the entire regime, the lawyers, the government bureaucrats, the university administration, they'll all work together to find some new way to undermine meritocracy and keep the social justice ball rolling, right?
Yeah, well, in Harvard's response to the Supreme Court ruling, which you can read on my Twitter account if you're so inclined, they respond by saying that instead of using race explicitly as a criteria, they're going to use essays concerning experience of race as a criteria.
Yeah, so funny.
That we'll see what the story of this how this story goes. But I'm certainly not betting on a return to hard meritocratic entryism in education as a result of the overturn of affirmative action as a constitutional policy. So anyways, it tells the story of the decline of meritocratic mechanisms for entry, and then it tells the story, which is quite an interesting story, of the concomitant increase in systemic failures as meritocratic entryism declines.
Right.
So,
And I just want to call out a repeated pattern of, I don't know, I guess you could call it the left, managerialism, I don't know, which is that we can take a functioning system and we can improve it according to some idea of social justice. And it will keep doing what it was doing, and it'll just be more socially just, right? So if it's stated that way, you can recognize the family resemblance between, say, socialism. Hey, we'll just take this economy and we'll just shift to government ownership of the means of production. The goods will still get produced, but now we'll make sure that those goods are distributed in a more socially just way, right?
yeah.
So that you can see the family resemblance between that and our current sort of civil rights regime, which is, hey, this is a really great, rich, highly productive system. We will redistribute jobs according to some notion of social justice, racial or whatever, disadvantaged people, whatever your criteria is. And it'll keep producing the goods. It's just it'll be more fair about, who gets these plum jobs, right?
Yeah.
And what he describes in this article is, yeah, it didn't work out this time either.
Yeah, well,
We started handing out the plum jobs for reasons other than competence, and planes are falling out of the sky,
Yeah,
so to speak. You know?
and he describes what is a process that I would argue is still in the relatively early stages. So,
Yeah. Yes.
if you consider that the Title IX of the Civil Rights Act passes in the mid '60s, but the the um, systemic hunt down of all the meritocratic mechanisms goes on for decades after that. So
Yeah.
by 1980, college admissions are substantially less meritocratic than they were in 1960. By 2000, there's another standard deviation less meritocratic. By 2023, they're very non-meritocratic. But you also have this delayed effect where most positions of power in our elite rest in the hands of people between the ages of sort of 55 and 90. So you have to figure that uh, there's like a 30-year lag,
Yeah.
and that lag is accentuated by the fact that graduates of graduates of each successive era are likely to be less competent and therefore less able to wrest positions of power from the previous generation.
Hmm.
And so you have this like delayed effect. So what we're seeing now is very likely a pale shadow of what we're
Yeah.
going to see over the next 20 to 50 years, regardless of whether this elite retain control or not, right?
Yeah.
This
And,
is I
I just wanted to bring in something that I'm sure you and I are both really aware of from working in the professional world, which is that uh, except as a signaling mechanism, um, degrees and so forth don't necessarily impress us. What impresses us is experience,
yeah,
right? People who have a proven ability to deliver, to be competent, right? That's what you really look for. Um, what we're looking at is a systematic removal of competent people from the ability to gain that critical experience.
that,
So let's say in 10 or 15 years, somebody goes, slaps their head and goes, "Oh my goodness, what have we been doing? Put competent people in place again." Well, now you don't have 45-year-old competent people that have been doing this for 20 years,
yeah.
right? It's a big problem. It's going to be hard to turn the
Well, and
ship around, even if we wanted to.
not only that,
Yeah.
if you wanted to go and recruit those competent people at age 45, you've ground their nose into the dirt for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
It's not going to be so easy to convince them that they should be recruited into the elite, right?
Yeah.
There's some track record after 1945. The U.S. was pretty good at convincing people whose noses it had ground into the dirt that they should become part of the American elite.
That's true.
But it's there's the success is far from universal. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to turn the ship, I don't know whether it's possible, but it's certainly not the kind of thing that you're going to wake up tomorrow morning and do.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and then like the rest of the article is basically a note that we live in modernity in this giant set of interlinked complex systems,
Yeah.
and each one of these subsystems is failing more and more often every year that goes
Right.
on. And so he like chronicles this long series of like basically accident rates in
Yeah.
systems that people depend on to live and stuff.
And a frightening amount of just straight up body counts through the article, right?
Well, my favorite is like the decline, the increase in rate of ship collisions in the U.S. Navy.
Right.
So, like, for those of you who don't know, the U.S. Navy has been more or less static in terms of number of ships, basically since the 50s. So there are actually less U.S. Navy ships going around today than there were in like 1945. But they run into each other more often, despite there being less of them, and despite there being better technology to avoid collisions. And you can track this over time. Like how often does the U.S. Navy run into each other or run into docking pylons or whatever? And it turns out that like all the technology in the world can't seem to make up for the fact that, uh, you know, the people operating the equipment are just getting worse and worse at doing it.
Hmm.
So,
Okay, so I think that's mostly what we wanted to get out of that article, as I recall, right?
yeah, that's it.
Yeah, and cascading failures because of interlocking systems, a shift from um, meritocratic to selecting on non-meritocratic diversity. Um, oh, sorry. Yeah, I am indeed wearing a tie that I bought from George Bagby at the conference. Somebody asked, and I like it very much.
There you
Um,
go.
uh, and yeah. Anyway, and and uh, and I think you brought this home, but something he drives home in the article is that the people who just get demoralized, who the competent people who get demoralized because they see someone getting promoted over them that is being promoted not because of competence, but to fill some minority hiring quota or because they're a woman or whatever it is. For the people who are competent, I loved this line in here because this has totally been my experience in my field, Black Horse. Competent people like to work with competent groups,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Um, you might think, and I'm sure there's people like this, but you might think that competent people want to be around people less competent than them so that they can like feel like lorded over them. And like I said, there's probably a few people like that. But in my experience, competent people find that extremely frustrating. They want to work with other competent people. They want to be able to trust their colleague that if you're going to work on that subsystem or whatever, it's going to come out right. So I don't have to worry about it, and I can focus on this other subsystem, or whatever. Um, so um, becomes really frustrating and demoralizing to be surrounded by incompetent people and then have incompetent people promoted over you. And so, as he says in the article, some of those competent people start
they,
to just throw up their hands and just not try very hard anymore. Or if they can afford it, just exit early, where in the past they might have been motivated. I was shocked when you said all the way up to 90 would
yeah.
be the elites. But
Well,
but yeah, you'll see that. You'll see people continuing to work hard and make amazing contributions into their 70s, their 80s. Um,
but
but why
I
would
mean,
you do that? Why would you do that? Why would you be motivated to do that in the
yeah.
current system, right?
Well, I mean, like, it's objectively the case that very old people are critical members of the American elite, from Warren
Mm-hmm.
Buffett to what's his name in foreign relations,
Kissinger.
Kissinger. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think Kissinger's like almost a
he's over
hundred.
100. He's
Yeah,
100 now. He had his birthday. Yeah,
and is like certainly until very recently has been contributing importantly to American foreign policy.
yeah.
So,
He turned
uh,
100 last month. I just
yeah,
looked it up,
yeah. So,
and they're still talking. They're still consulting him.
yeah. So, I mean, as wild as that is, that is the world we live in. So,
Yeah.
and so like this deals with factor number one in our elite, which is elite competence. So elite competence is very obviously declining. You can see that it's declining either from accident rates. You can see that it should be declining based on lack of meritocratic selection. You have a whole pile of disparate elements of data that all agree here. Elite competence is declining. And
Mm-hmm.
so what you have is an empire that should be weaker to external forces, but it's an empire that has almost no external enemies. And so, what happens next? Well, the article makes the argument that complex systems are beginning to collapse, and you'll see, you know, it doesn't directly make, but it kind of implicitly makes a billions must die kind of argument. Um, I
I didn't catch that part.
Well, so I mean, it talks about the complex system of global trade. If you think about the consequences of the breakdown of the complex system of global trade, it basically means the entire population of the third world dies because the entire population of the
Yeah.
third world is dependent on food exported from like
Right.
a half a dozen countries.
Yeah, I
So,
remember. I remember during the lockdowns that people predicted, and I think their predictions came true, that because of some of the decisions that were being made in the developed world, the developing world would disproportionately suffer.
Yeah, there was
Yeah.
a pretty harsh famine, particularly in East Africa, but
Hmm.
the scale of that, um, for for better or for worse, the third world is a lot better off today than it was 30
Yes,
years ago.
it
And
is.
so the scale of that destruction was less than some people feared.
Right.
But nevertheless, if you're predicting the collapse of complex systems in the West, you're implicitly predicting an absolute catastrophe for people outside the West.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's one element. The other question is elite unity,
Right.
and this is a complicated question. So if you want to understand the so you have radically divergent opinions as to how well aligned the interests of the elite that operate the global American empire
Yeah,
are.
I was going to comment, Black Horse, that I'm not able to pull a site out of my brain, but I'm thinking of Nicholas Soldo and
Yeah, you have
different
Soldo at
commentators.
one end of the spectrum, and you
Yeah,
have Charles Haywood at the other end of the spectrum.
right. So Nicholas Soldo would be they are more united than ever, and I think, right.
Yes, he would be
Yeah, and
they're very united, and Haywood would say, push a little bit on them, and they'll fracture into a million pieces.
right, right. So in other words, these are two people who are, how do we put it, fully read up. They've taken all the red pills. They know all the stuff. They all know all the elite theory, and yet they have different perspectives on this particular issue, right?
Yes,
So it's a complex. I think where we would be more agreed across all of these thinkers here on the competence issue than we would be on the unity issue. Fair to say,
that's absolutely fair to say.
right?
But there's an important point here. So how did the elite that runs the American empire become united in terms of their interests? Well, one of the mechanisms, maybe not the only one, but certainly one of the mechanisms, is that they were able to take this huge swath of territory in Middle America, take the other territories that they controlled after 1945, and recruit elites from across this territory, break their bonds to their people and their place, and insert them into the hierarchy, into positions of power.
Right.
And they did that first and foremost from the places that had the highest degree of competence. So they went
Yeah.
to they went and selected all the best people from all the places that they had conquered and put them in their elite.
Who helped us? Who helped us get to the moon? And where were they
Yes,
from?
yeah.
Don't look too closely at that. Yeah.
Who built the atom bomb in the first place? It wasn't Americans.
Right. Right.
Um,
Et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I bring up an amusing example, right? But we could go across many fields and see the same sort of thing.
yeah, and uh, I mean, you can look at this today in the field of tech. So I shared a graph for you, if you want to pull that up.
Yes. Go ahead.
So this just looks at compensation in various fields in various jurisdictions, and you'll see when you look at it that in medicine and in like software engineering, IT, the opportunity to make money in the United States, like this is a purchasing power comparison, so not a raw dollars comparison. So on a purchasing power basis, as a software developer in the United States, you can make like 5 times what you can make in India,
Mm-hmm.
more than twice what you can make in the United Kingdom or Australia.
Yeah.
So, y- given the way that immigration policy works and this dynamic, you can understand why all the best software engineers are in the United States, or
Yeah. Right.
like a hugely disproportionate number of them. But you'll see that in things like law, uh, that mechanism is not operating the way that it might once have operated. So
Right.
there are excellent opportunities in a wide variety of fields outside the United States that have comparable purchasing power today, with with professional experience inside the United States. Moreover, the closure of the Ivy League on the basis of merit to, you know, substantial populations within the American empire,
Hmm.
in favor of, you know, other groups that are being preferentially selected for whatever reason, uh, is forcing those people to stay in the jurisdictions in which they were born, and
Yeah.
uh, and is forcing them to. I mean, I think this is a big part of what created the. Well, I don't want to overread, but it's certainly cutting off the mechanism that created elite unity in the United States in the period
Hmm.
between sort of 1920 and 19, maybe even like up to 2000. So
I wanted to say it's not as stark as the general practitioner, which would be a medical doctor, right?
yeah,
Um, but looking at that lawyer, the comparison between USA, UK, and Australia, I would say nobody's moving to the US for that. I
no,
mean, it is better in the US, but it's just not enough better to up sticks and go to another country, right?
that's right. And if you think about what lawyers tend to do, like almost all politicians are former lawyers.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of lawyer, lawyers don't tend to be tend to be there tend to be fewer lawyers that become entrepreneurs, but certainly there are a lot of lawyers in positions of power in
Hmm.
society.
Right.
So the fact that the number of people coming to the United States to become like law partners from the most competent jurisdictions inside the American empire is declining is likely to undermine future unity, future elite unity uh, in the American empire.
Right, and just to spell it out to make it obvious, why would that be? It's because you now have people who, that process we described of strip mining the provinces and bringing them to the center of the empire. Well, that's not happening as much, at least in certain areas, certain critical areas when it comes to political stuff, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how much software developers get involved in politics, but lawyers do. And so now we have lawyers in this example staying in the UK and Australia, potentially staying more loyal to their home country and no longer pulling for team GAE
Yes.
anymore, right?
Well, and especially if you project this out, because competence is extremely heritable. You can fight all you want
Mm,
about whether it's genetic or whether it's environmental, but it's
right.
because parents create most of the environment for their children, competence is extremely heritable. And
Yeah.
so if you project this out over generations, like the damage that the American Empire did to all of the provincial jurisdictions by breaking the bonds of their elites with their people, uh, was incalculable, because it broke generational chains that went back a very long way. But if you, the way that those generational bonds between the people and the land are, between the elites, their people, and their land are reestablished is by stopping that process. And you can see that that process is slowing down in in areas that have historically produced extremely competent people.
And people in the chat were talking about black pills. You're talking about the world is healing itself here, right, Blackman?
Yes, nature is healing.
Nature is healing. Yes.
So, like, if you were, it was a miraculous set of circumstances that led to, for example, Lee Kuan
Hmm.
returning to Singapore and participating in Singaporean politics rather than being swept up in some other occupation after he left Singapore and
Hmm.
studied at the London School of Economics. The opportunities, I mean, he couldn't have known that he'd become the ruler of Singapore.
Yeah. Yeah.
The regular opportunities for a lawyer or like a graduate of the London School of Economics at that time would have been vastly better, in the West than they were back home. So it was quite
Right.
unlikely for him to return home. Let's erase the fact that Lee Kuan might be it's questionable whether Lee Kuan would have been categorized as diverse these days or not. It's kind of hard to say,
Yeah.
but assume for a moment that he wasn't. A lot of those opportunities for success in the West would have been cut off, and so it would be it's much more likely today that the future Lee Kuan goes home and does whatever he does than it is that he becomes like, I don't know, a partner in a bank firm in the city of London. And so you're talking about a very fundamental breakdown in the mechanism that previously produced a united elite across the territories of the American Empire.
Right. Right. Which, we're talking big time horizons, as I think we've already indicated. This doesn't mean that like UK breaks from the American Empire next year, right? It's
No,
it's more watching a trend line
it's
that over time will add up to something significant, right?
and you can see it like if you look at the boomer elite in the United Kingdom, they're much more committed to Americanism
Mm-hmm.
than their children are.
Mm-hmm.
They're
Right.
much more committed to like just a whole variety of elements of it.
Yeah.
So that's like a very interesting data point in analysis of what the future elite will be, sort of projected out, 20 or 30 years. So those are really the two criteria that we want to evaluate when assessing the health of our present elite. We also made kind of an interesting comment that in circumstances where there are few genuinely foreign enemies for an empire, often the exogenous elite that challenges an incompetent elite is one that develops regionally or either fractures off from the existing elite or develops regionally. So I think at this juncture it makes some sense to talk about what political projects might be useful in this kind of circumstance. So
Mm-hmm.
a lot of what we do in this space is really focused on this reality, right? It's focused on the fact that we have this large body of highly competent, mostly young men who are locked out of positions of power and are therefore not assimilating into the elite. You know,
Right.
value-free analysis. Most of our audience, if they had been given high-quality jobs in the elite, and if they had been, if their cultural sensibilities had been appealed to in those jobs,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
would very likely not be here, right?
Mm-hmm.
They would not. Their grudges against the elite that presently run the American Empire, they're mostly not blood grudges, right? The American Empire doesn't have a lot of blood enemies. It has some in the Arab world, but
Mm-hmm.
our audience is mostly not the Arab world, right?
Right.
Maybe you could say that the American Empire is producing some blood enemies in Russia right now, but it's not. That's not the kind of challenge we see internally. We what we see is the effect of the politics of exclusion, and so how do you take the side effects of the politics of exclusion and and frankly make the regime pay a price for what it's done?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's hard and it's a very, very long game, but
Yeah.
what you have to do is you have to create one more elites that have a grudge against the elite which presently runs the American Empire, have a set of interests that are divergent in the long term from theirs, have like a set of clients that they carry along with them. You have to give them opportunities to become educated, to, as Ted Kaczynski would say, participate in the power process, feel as though they're doing something real and useful. And so a lot of what's being done in this space is about how do you filter and assemble a set of elites outside of out of this wreckage of people who've been placed on the outside by the politics of exclusion.
Yeah, and I just wanted to comment as a lifelong outsider. um,
Yeah.
I do feel like I see a shift, and it really is brought home when I go to these in-person events like the Nashville convention last weekend. Um, I do see a shift towards higher status individuals, I guess you could say. Um, the people who are disaffected are more and more disaffected elites. And unfortunately, that when I say that, I'm using elite in a different sense than the
Yeah.
sense we used it earlier, right?
Yeah, they're disaffected high competence individuals.
Yeah, maybe that.
Right.
Yeah, disaffected high competence, right?
And
Yeah, you know,
and so the
and
political
you know,
process is how do you, the political project is how do you put tools in their hands that
yeah,
are kind of worthy, that allow them to develop a base of power from which to operate. That's a very non-trivial project. But when you hear about things like the Beowulf Foundation, about things like the Old Glory Club, the nature of that political project is not about. It's about taking this weapon that's being handed to us and doing something useful with it.
being smart about it. Yeah,
So
absolutely. Um, you're making me want to share. You're making me want to show the Old Glory Club because we're
well,
just getting going with chapters, and I want to give people talk about it and give people a way to
yeah, I
have
mean
fun.
that's interesting because like the Old Glory Club is launching chapters. That's great. It's got this sort of fraternal organization structure. You can kind of follow along our loose series going through the history of fraternal organizations to see how, maybe that would work if it gets up and going. But we should never lose sight in the development of that organization that as much as it might be a benefit organization, the primary purpose of creating organizations like this is to create is to equip people placed on the wrong end of the politics of exclusion and create an elite capable of
Right.
challenging the elite which presently govern us. It's great that maybe people at some point in the future will be able to buy cancellation insurance from their fraternal organization,
Right.
but that's not the primary purpose. The primary purpose of doing this is to the primary purpose of this of creating such organizations is other than that.
Okay, you're saying the quiet part loud. Enough of that. it's a it's a mutual aid
Yeah, there you go.
organization. Anyway, uh, I've shared in the chat a link to Paul Fahrenheit's tweet talking about how to get involved if you're interested in uh, joining or helping form a chapter of the Old Glory Club. So we would love to have you as part of that. I've been I was the first president of the Old Glory Club last year, and we it was impressive. I don't know if I hadn't gotten a chance to tell you this. It was quite a thing after meeting every week virtually to suddenly be sitting around sort of like a boardroom table with just a ton of us. These are all the people who have been actively working on this as founding members. Founding members or just a couple others that we had added since then. And just sitting around physically with all these people, just the number of them, the impressiveness of them, it really came home, made it feel all more real.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
So, anyways, that is there anything else you wanted us to cover on this section?
yeah, let me think about just, well, let me just summarize real quick. So, what do we look for in a neutrally speaking? You're an auditor. You're an elite auditor, right?
Yes.
And you don't have any skin in the game. You've just been called in to assess the elite in Iran or Russia or the United States Empire or whatever, and you want to use some sort of objective criteria. What do you use? As Black Horse has said, you look at how unified they are, how competent they are. Um, Sub points under that, you want to see how are they selecting into the elite. because an elite, you can only last so long by having a generation of elite people who just get really really old and keep running everything.
Not
You
to
know,
put too fine a point on it, but
yeah, right. But eventually, they die,
yes.
and
If not,
and
if not before that, they die.
yeah, eventually they die, and then the question is, well, what comes next, right? If you have a functioning elite, they have been bringing up a next generation. They have been giving them experience. They've been bringing people in who are going to make a good next generation of elites. And this is not impossible, by the way. I think we have examples of empires, or maybe not even empires, just kingdoms or whatever, where they were able to have a good set of elites, good in the sense of, competent and so forth, um, for many generations, for hundreds of years, even. I think
Yeah,
it's been done.
yeah. I
You
mean,
know,
if you, how long did a single elite class dominate the British Empire, from
yeah,
the end of Cromwell until really, maybe World War One?
right.
That's a long time.
Yeah, yeah, hundreds of years.
Um,
Right. So it certainly can be done. But, America's all about live fast, die young, right? So,
yeah, I guess.
we're seeing that this epic cycle that can take hundreds of years seems to be moving along. I know it seems like a long time for those of us who are living through it, but from the historical perspective, the movement from having a period of competent elites to our current incompetent elites has been lightning fast. It's like, historically speaking, you blink and suddenly it's like, what happened to the U.S. empire?
Well,
It was like so dominant and competent, and
to be
now
to be
it's
quite
on the
clear,
edge.
like almost all elites historically have had like a an inheritance method of recruitment. So most of the new
Mm-hmm.
elites were the sons of the previous elites.
Right.
Uh, the United States, the American Empire is quite unique in having this. Uh, like, if you spend time around elite families, you'll notice that actually there's a lot of movement in and out of the elite of the American Empire generationally.
Mm.
There are at the upper end, maybe not as much, but certainly at the lower end of the elite, there's a lot of families whose fortunes, who, generationally will come into the elite and generationally will leave the elite. Partly because of the college mechanism, but also because I, there must be something about the way that Americans raise children that produces like I just know this from my own experience. I've seen a lot of millennials, Gen Xers, and a lot of millennials and Gen Xers, exit the lower half of the global American elite
Hmm.
due to incompetence.
Right. Yeah, I feel like you are not believing in Prince Hunter Biden taking things over.
And yeah, exactly. Hunter Biden is like a first class example of this. Maybe Hunter Biden gets to ride the coattails of his parents, but whoever Hunter Biden's children are, um,
Yeah.
he may or may not know them, and they're certainly not going to be members of the American elite.
Right. Um, okay, well, Mickey has a super chat. He
Sure.
says, counterpoint on lawyers breaking anything about the globalist American empire. Lawyers do not do that. They are extremely conservative and always support the status quo. They cement everything everywhere. Except when they don't,
Yeah.
I would say. Just thinking about some examples that come to mind of lawyers being involved with, I don't know.
I mean,
Wasn't Gandhi a lawyer?
lawyers who are actually practicing law don't break the status quo, but uh, well, a lot of the best lawyers don't spend their whole life being lawyers.
Hmm. Right,
So,
right.
I mean, Gandhi didn't break the status quo when he was a lawyer. He broke the status quo when he was doing something quite different.
Um, Thanks to a new subscriber who I think joined during the show on Subscribestar. Really appreciate it. I will send you a note. I've been learning to just send a note to everybody and thank them. And
Fantastic.
Sam153 over at Subscribestar. You don't even have to do a monthly thing to do tips on Subscribestar. And then Google doesn't get the money and they take less. Sam153, generous tip, thank you, says, glad to hear the event was a success. Great Mrs. Radlib stream debriefing. So that was the previous stream on my channel. I shared the link in the live chat, or you can just look it up.
Yeah.
I should make sure it's under
I
Mrs.
watched that
Radlib.
stream. It was quite nice.
Thank you.
I didn't get to. I spent a lot of time organizing the event, but I didn't get to go to the event, so it was nice
Right.
to hear somebody talk about how it went. So
Yes, and I realize I have not added that to the Mrs. Radlib series, which I'm going to fix right now to make it easier for everyone to find. Okay, done. All right. So yeah, if you go to my homepage on YouTube, Radical Liberation channel, you will find that. Scroll down just a little, you'll see Mrs. Radlib, and it's the first one on the left there. Event report on Forging a Common Foundation, which was the name of the event last weekend.
yeah.
Any comments on more? I can put it on the screen. I keep forgetting. Any more comments on Mickey's comment about lawyers?
No, but there is one other interesting comment in the chat that I see.
Okay.
Pointing out that the question of how to generationally transition power in elites it's old enough that Plato wrote about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually what his discourse, how can virtue be taught, is apparently all about. I'm not a big Plato scholar, so I can't answer much about it, but it's certainly an age-old problem, and it's certainly a problem with varying solutions.
Yeah, the commenter further goes on. Plato's answer evolved from no to yes, but I only have a rough guess as to how.
Yeah. Well, when I say that there's something very historically odd about the difficulty that present American elites have generationally. Some of it may just be that present American elites have very few children, and so, if you look at the British Empire in the 19th century, all of the disfavored sons get, there's enough sons in a family that you can get rid of the disfavored ones and like send them off to America or something. Whereas if you're a present American elite, the odds that you have more than one son to deal with are pretty low. So
that's true.
That might be an element of it, but there's got to be something about American education and child rearing that historically accounts for it. I mean, certainly American education and child rearing is like a wild historical outlier, so it shouldn't be surprising that it would be involved with it.
Yeah, something that's on my mind is the ethnic/racial aspect of developments in the U.S. empire over the last, throughout my lifetime and a bit before. This is on my mind because I'm listening to Martyr Made podcast, his latest episode, where the Black and Jewish Alliance breaks up in the mid-'60s. And he describes a very dramatic episode of it. But broadly speaking, what we're looking at is a set of up-and-comers from various ethnic and racial categories, Catholics who were outsiders in a Protestant America, right? Jews, blacks, so on and so forth. They're all sort of united against the WASPs, against the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who hold the positions of power. Now it's becoming sort of ludicrous when they talk about the, how dominant the WASP is or something. Because that's a long time ago now. And it's
not only is it a long time ago, like no young person can like apply to Harvard, have a huge preference on his admission, and have like a giant list of scholarships that only apply to him as a non-member of this group, and then think, oh my goodness, we're like totally locked out of power by the evil WASPs. Like it's just not a plausible narrative.
Right, and so what I'm driving at here is that having defeated the WASP elite, I would say they won. This coalition, they've got a big problem now that they're on top. They don't like each other.
Not only do they not like each other,
they're not united. They have competing interests.
They don't have a narrative about. They don't have a narrative about the purpose of their existence.
Yeah. It's this negative vision problem, I think, that we've discussed a lot in these circles. Yeah. They had the negative vision, which is dislodge the WASPs in favor of us.
Yeah.
Then they win, and they don't have any positive vision
Yeah.
to unite them as a ruling elite and say, okay, here's how we can work together to run this place for many generations to come.
So they're
It,
like
it, it
running on the
seems
fumes of like let's leverage the dispossessed trans people. We don't have enough of
right.
them in the elite. We need to recruit as many of them and get them into elite positions as possible.
Right, and it's becoming comical, right?
Yeah.
In their search to, I'm sorry, their quest to keep running on against the wasps,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Against what they call the majority, which is hardly the majority anymore. Um,
Well,
so,
certainly if you look at the American Empire, like one of the you could kind of keep this vision going longer by pretending that the American Empire ended at the borders of the 48 states or whatever. But I mean, if you look at the American Empire as a whole, the idea that the
mhm,
WASP is anything like a majority is just it doesn't make any sense.
right, yeah, and so what does this mean? This means that that unity that we've talked about, that the elites need to have, has become really, really challenging. um, they've won. They've taken over everything, right? As we often observe, all the institutions are controlled by the current set of elites, um, and it's the old if the dog catches the car it's chasing, what does it do with it, right?
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
now they've got the mighty U.S. empire in their hands, and they don't even agree on what comes next,
yeah. I
right?
mean, they
That's
seem
a
to
problem.
they seem to agree that they should loot it, but
Yeah, right.
that's
Yeah, but that's this does not give you a multi-generational stable elite situation, right?
yeah,
This is something that lasts until uh, you run out of things to loot or people get tired of being looted.
yeah, yeah. Exactly.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, I think
Okay.
that's a great show.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for
I
everyone
think
for
I,
listening.
I think we're good. And let me just do one last check. I believe they really improved, made a great improvement, as AA has commented in StreamYard, where you just tab over and you see all the super chats all there, and you don't have to scroll back and find them, and they don't scroll off. Fabulous. I'm going to write StreamYard right now and thank them. Um, yeah, they aren't going after Catholics. Um, I don't know.
We'll
Good
see.
question, but it's intra elite competition, I would say. In that case, like I was saying, it's fractious. Okay, thanks everyone, and thank you, Black Horse. And I think, oh, exciting! Through a group that Black Horse and I are part of, I was able to arrange something for next week. I have one bit of confirmation. I think it should be good though. Ryan Turnipseed, as some of you know, my other co-host, has been trying to fight subversion in his own denomination, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And I found out that there's another group that works on this sort of project. And I won't even name them, but if all goes well, I've got commitment from one side. It's actually Ryan I need to double check with. Um, but I should be getting a representative from that group and Ryan together on the show next week to talk about fighting subversion in the churches, which I think is really critical. It's one of the points I made in my speech this weekend, that this is a really critical issue because the churches have been, unfortunately, a source through the what so-called theological liberals. It's been a source of a lot of trouble. So fighting on that front is important, not only for spiritual reasons but for other reasons. So I'm really excited about that conversation, and it should be happening 1 week from today on this channel. All right, thanks everyone. Bye.
All right.